In this video, I want to take a look at painting up some orc ARDBOYZ and how to get them onto the table super quickly into your Big Wot or Ironjawz army, but making sure we have a ton of fun and they look really cool. Instead of using a large collection of paints on these models, we're going to try to make some cool choices using only a handful of paints, including charred brown, NATO black, gory red, Strachan green, orange brown, retributor gold, stormhost silver, electric blue, pastel green, dryad bark, and white. This will help speed things up as we'll mostly only be using a layer of 2 of each color over a uniform base coat of charred brown. I was using a more typical brush for this at first, but switched over to a larger flat brush for the better coverage and just general quickness. Overall, we're not looking for perfectly solid opacity, just trying to make sure there's some color all over to act as an undertone. For an easy beat up and weathered armor on all the metal plates, we're going to be stippling on NATO black using a brush I usually use for dry brushing, building up a nice texture and avoiding all the recesses and meeting points of the metal. This will allow the charred brown to resemble rust and grime. For some of the harder to reach areas, I used a smaller, more typical brush and emulate similar mark making. I'm then going to mix up roughly a 50-50 mix of charred brown and white and use a similar technique on the cloth pants, just hitting the more raised areas, creating some quick highlighting. We're then going to take the same color and use a typical brush to do some edge highlighting on the belts and straps. Don't worry about getting every edge, we're just trying to pick these out and define the shape a bit. You can also do some scratches and distressing for some extra texture, and also go over some of those folds on the pants fabric to help sharpen them. This is also dry brushed over the wooden handles of the spears, really utilizing some different techniques to get a lot of value and variance out of the same color. Just doing a couple light passes to highlight those different edges and adding interest. For the bandage wraps around the wrists and ankles, you could really take your time and layer these up, but I dislike painting stuff like this in bulk and I want to go fast, so I'm going to add more white to the charred brown until we get an off-white and just start picking out those individual strands with paint strokes, focused mostly on the upper facing areas. If these areas start to get a little muddy, you can always flow in some really watered down charred brown to help add some definition between the wraps. All of the orc flesh is going to be painted with Strachan green, which is nice and desaturated, making it really suitable for these ARDBOYZ. We're going to be doing everything with just this one color, and since this is quite a jump up from the charred brown, I found it easiest to have a variety of paint consistencies mixed up. First, I used a standard thinness of paint to stipple and scratch at the tops of each muscle form, trying to define them and making the color the densest at the peak, creating a highlight. Then I take something more like a glaze of the same color and drag it up towards the top, fading the two colors together. For the smaller features like the hands, I just make sure to layer up the paint on the knuckles and other edges to help define them and build volume. Some of the skin will be hard to define due to it being tucked between armor, and since we're doing a whole squad, this won't be perfect, but it's a fun way to pick out some of the muscles quickly and create a really striking look on the tabletop. For all of the drapey cloth on the upper part of the models, we're going to introduce an accent color with gory red. This goes over the charred brown super well, and subsequent layers produce a really nice vivid red. By focusing on smaller areas with each pass, we're able to produce a smooth fade and highlight the cloth really nicely. We're also going to take this and use it to pick out the straps on the weapons. I'm not being too precious here, just using it pretty unthinned and picking out the various bandages, letting some of that charred brown peek out between the strands and leaving it showing on the underside of the weapon. One thing I am really excited about on these is the weapons, and having something really striking for these helps while trying to paint a unit quickly. I'm going to be going for a really heavily patinaed look, but of course you can paint them like steel or even follow the same recipe as the metal armor if you like. For the first color, I mix electric blue and orange brown in a 50-50 mix to create a sort of desaturated jade color. I then stipple this onto the weapon, trying to hit each plane or section in the center, building up texture, focusing on adding more color towards the tip of the weapon, making a gradient. I then also do a bit of dry brushing to smooth it out if the texture is looking too extreme, but overall we want some nice contrast. I then use pastel green to do a couple choice sections of stippling to put some solid dots down, and then dry brush it on, again focusing on creating a gradient, getting lighter towards the end. You can see how leaving some specks of charred brown showing through in the previous step really sets them up to look like dings in the metal, and overall this creates a really deep textured or marbled look really easily. The armor plates need a little extra love, so we're going to water down some orange brown until it's runny and add it to emulate some rust and weathering. The thinner this is, the easier it is to flow into the nooks and crannies, but the more prone it is to pooling as well, so it takes a bit of babysitting to make sure you're not getting those watermarks. A less thin mix will be more saturated, but you'll have to be more deliberate with it as well, as it won't flow into place as easily. Overall though, I'm placing this between armor plates and around rivets where gunk and grime would collect. I also do a bit of stippling and put some really thin layers around the edges of the larger flat areas just to help break them up. For all the bone trinkets and especially the tusks on the helmets, I'm going to mix dryad bark and white to create a cool off-white that contrasts well with all the other browns. I try and hit all the sharp edges of the tusks, dragging my brush down towards the tip, adding extra layers and building up opacity at the end. To create a smoother transition, really thin layers can also be used. I also painted this icon as bone with the same color, using really small marks and scratches to build up the color and depth, but after re-looking at the box art, I realized this is supposed to be metal, but I guess it looked like jaws to me. Speaking of jaws though, we're going to be giving them a pop of color with Retributor Gold. First, making sure to hit all those upward facing edges, helping to define this section. A thin layer is then added, giving the planes that are facing upwards additional passes to make them a solid gold color, creating a really high contrast look. To complete the ARDBOYZ, Stormhost Silver is going to be used and dry brushed over the metal armor plates. This is used sparingly and only to catch the most extreme angles and sharp edges, like around the tops of the shoulders, knees, and shields, as well as on the chainmail. Some of the hammer beaten texture of their armor can also be picked out, but it's important to go softly and slowly with this step, as it's a pretty big jump in value from the NATO black. I then use a typical brush to pick out any edges that needed additional defining, and any chainmail that was hard to reach, as well as little bits and bobs and trinkets. And with that, our ARDBOYZ are complete, and you can give them whatever basing fits into your army scheme, but for me, before they were primed, I added a combination of twine to simulate roots, some texture paste, as well as static grass. The bases were then painted with these 4 colors: burnt umber, gold oxide, teal green, and yellow green. Some nice earthy colors that are perfect for basing. I first take burnt umber, a dark earth tone, and give the bases an all-over coat, dabbing on some water with my brush to break up the paint and help it get into that dense basing material. I'm going to then be using gold oxide, mostly focused around the clumps of foliage, again using water to help it penetrate down into the ground. This color is a little intense out of the tube, so I also mix some of the burnt umber into it to help knock it back a bit. The static grass is picked out with teal green, softly brushing it over the area, hitting all those little strands of grass. I also mix this with the gold oxide to create a drab olive green and scrub this over the foliage area, adding variety and coloring the twine. In general, I think the basing really benefits from the colors bleeding together, giving it a natural look. Yellow-green is then added to give an additional mossy look to those roots made out of twine, and also a final pop of color where it's looking a little drab. A final touch I like to do on my orc bases is some dark mud. This is made out of clear tacky glue with some water added to help make it more spreadable. A tiny drop of dark paint is also added for color. As this is mixed together, a lot of air is whipped into the mud, forming small bubbles. These stick around as it dries, and I really enjoy the look, but if you're trying to avoid them, you can use the back of the brush or a toothpick, as it seems to incorporate less air than the brush hairs do. I apply this to the bases to all the flat areas, leaving the clumps of foliage sticking out, first placing a blob and then spreading it out. This contracts quite a bit and darkens once it dries, so if you really want to build it up, you might need extra layers. For these guys, I tried out the clear tacky glue, but I think I prefer the standard white tacky glue, as it seems to shrink less as it dries and ends up looking a little more gooey and mucky. Despite their more elite size, the ARDBOYZ are actually more like your rank and file type of unit, so it's really nice to be able to just chunk through these guys pretty quickly. When I first started in the hobby, painting 10 models seemed like such a daunting task, but it's really rewarding to be able to paint a unit like this quickly in a way that I'm still stoked about how they look on the tabletop. I think having that cool weapon and golden gob gives them a really striking look, plus all the other smart choices with mark making and different ways we applied the paint is a really effective and efficient way to paint, and I'm really happy with them. I don't think they'll be winning any painting awards on their own, but mixed into an army where the heroes and centerpiece models have been given a little more love would definitely score some nice hobby points. I also have a couple other videos on my channel where I dive into painting orcs a bit more in depth you can check out. Thanks for watching.